I was hitching from New York to Seattle over the summer of 1998 when I met them. The trip started out as an adventure of an idea that gradually decayed into a nightmare. I'd left home with a head full of Kerouac and his buddies, beatniks hitching across America, learning lessons and getting cool kicks. That all slips away pretty quick when you're 60 miles from the next town and it's the middle of the night and pissing rain and your socks are wet and your shoes have holes in them and there's no money in your wallet and no food in your belly. Or the first time some nice guy who offered you a ride sets his hand on your thigh and gives you this cold smile. But I was determined, and really I had no choice. I guess I could have phoned my parents and had them wire me some money, but it's not like they had the cash to spare. And besides, that would have been admitting failure, and I was still too young and too stupid for that kind of insight. So, point is, I'm not really sure where I was when they found me. Some trucker had been giving me a ride across Montana when we got into what you might call a quarrel about current affairs. And we'd both agreed that me taking my leave of his vehicle was preferable to him reshaping the side of my skull with his tire iron. So I was walking in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, when this van pulls up. They offer me a ride and I say yes, and that starts the weirdest 3 weeks of my life. The guy driving the van was this little steroid freak. I guess he'd wanted to get into the army when he was younger, but he was too small. That must have bugged him a bit, because it seems like he'd spent the rest of his life since then working out and snorting or shooting up anything that would get him a little larger. He looked like a 5-foot cube of raw beef. Scary look in his eyes. I think he really wanted a war to fight. Every new city we came to, he'd find some gym to join where he'd work out and pick fights with the locals until he was banned. I think the longest he ever lasted at one gym was 3 hours. The shortest was 10 minutes. 10 minutes into a session on the bench press and he'd broken into a huge crying fit and then broken some guy's ribs throwing a set of free weights across the room. Sitting up front with the driver was a real quiet, nervous guy. I think he was stoned all the time. His buddy said he had cancer, one of the rare but equally fatal kinds. He said to me one time when we were sharing a joint that he thought he had the cancer because back before, in his life, he'd been so mad all the time. This guy, he thought the cancer was feeding on his anger. The way he saw it, the madder he got, the sicker he'd get. So he had to stay calm all the time, just to flush all the bad thoughts out of his system. His buddy said he'd been through some sort of an radiation exposure though, and they were all pretty sure that's what caused his cancer, not his bad temper. He'd been working on some experimental bomb for the army, that's what they said, but the army shit-canned him when he'd started manifesting big tumors all throughout his body, and now they wouldn't even admit that he'd worked there. It was a hell of a story, if it was true. There was this Norwegian guy with them. Big fat party dude, and his thing was mushrooms and plenty of them. LSD or MDMA when he could get it, but mushrooms were a constant. Anytime we'd stop in the middle of nowhere, like between towns, he'd head off into the woods and return an hour later with a big bag full of mysterious-looking fungi. He was the only one who'd eat the stuff, and I guess he never died, though he did throw up a lot and seemed to alternate between bouts of constipation and diarrhea. He'd walk around shirtless and shoeless all day in just a pair of old slacks with a big claw hammer hanging from one of the belt loops. I'd see him staring off into the sky for hours. When you asked him what he was doing, he'd just laugh and say he was controlling the weather. And he acted like he meant it too. Like he'd get mad at the clouds when they didn't do what he was thinking, that sort of thing. Nasty body odor. He had ash-white hair that hung down his back in a couple of enormous braids that eventually grew all matted and thick. They were being bankrolled by some rich kid with a pacemaker. He spent most of his time goofing around on a shiny laptop he carried with him everywhere he went, though I think he mostly just used it to try to talk to girls online. I don't know if I ever saw him sober. One of those obnoxious little shits who can't shut up or grow a decent beard. They never really explained what his heart condition was, but I did see the scar from where his pacemaker went in, and it looked real enough. Pretty much everything else he said sounded like total bullshit, though. He loved the sound of his own voice and had a theory about anything that you could think about. He had that nervous energy as somebody who always has to be the center of attention. There was this girl with him, too. Some Russian runaway. She acted like she was always watching people, taking notes. But I took a peek at what she was writing one time, and it was just nonsense. Gothic poetry, that sort of stuff. She said that she'd been married once when she was much younger, and that she'd killed him on their wedding night. Honestly, of all of them, she seemed the least stable, and I kept my distance from her. So they claimed they were on a secret revenge mission, and it was only after we'd been traveling together for a few days that I realized they were some sort of paramilitary cult. The Norwegian, he claimed that he could see things, like these shape-shifting, shadowy invaders, which he thought were trying to infect society. He'd go off about that stuff whenever he was peaking on his psychedelics, which was every 23 hours or so if he wasn't puking or shitting himself. He'd start ranting about secrets his people knew back home, and these looming, intangible threats. He was always worried about these things that would come here, invisible outsiders looking to take what was ours. Honestly, it all sounded pretty racist. But the others just encouraged him. They were into it. They loved the dream, the delusion, that they were these special warriors, chosen by God to carry out some sacred mission. Oh, and they hated cops. They all really hated cops. They took any rule or law as an affront to their personal freedom. They thought they were above all that. They said that people should be able to make their own choice, to be beyond the laws. It didn't even make sense when they were saying it, but it was still fun to hear them say it. I should have just bailed. I should have. I know that now. I got swept up in it. Did I believe it? I can't say that I did, but I was really messed up a lot back then. Drinking and taking basically whatever was offered to me. I think if you'd put a gun to my head, I'd have admitted that no, I didn't really believe the crazy shit these folks thought was real life. But I liked playing along. It gave me a place to be, some direction and purpose. Even if it was all just made-up madness. But it was when we hit Seattle that it all fell apart. That's where the Norwegian got picked up by the cops with blood all over his hammer. He was screaming and ranting in just his pair of pants in the middle of some downtown intersection. Once they ran him in, it turned out he'd murdered some Mexican family, claiming they were shapeshifters and only he could see their true alien forms. And it turned out he'd been doing stuff like that for the whole trip. He had a trail of maybe 36 bodies behind himself. Behind all of us. The little steroid dude got shot in the face when he freaked out and tried to attack the cops. He was frothing at the mouth when they took him down, or so they said. Like a mad dog. I think he broke a cop's arm before they took him out, which might be impressive. I don't know, I wasn't there. I was with the cancer guy who was in the middle of overdosing on heroin. I think he thought the smack was going to kill the cancer instead of him. Obviously, that's not how it works. He had the needle already in his arm when I popped open the van door and discovered him there. Then he slammed down the plunger and blasted off to nowhere. That smug little rich kid, I swear to Christ, he thought it was funny. He laughed about it. I don't remember thinking anything, I just lashed out and hit him. Broke his nose, I suspect. So him and the Russian girl took off together, but I heard she split town a day later and was never seen again. The rich kid ran off back to his family home and went on living whatever lifestyle was afforded to him. That was it. He was gone, like he'd never been there at all. They were a sad cluster of misfits, not built for the real world. It was no surprise when they imploded like they did. I got picked up by the cops a few days later and Wound up getting charged as an accessory. They put enough years on me. I don't think I'm ever going to see the outside world again. So there you go. In life, you got to try to be careful, I guess. That next van you jump into, it might just be your last. They were crazy, but they were dreamers. You got to give them that. They had big ideas. They thought they could see things normal people couldn't see. They thought they could be things that normal people couldn't be. But it turns out, they weren't marvels after all. They were just ordinary people. And those have a tendency to be kind of shitty. Anyway, that's my story. Now, you gonna give me that cigarette or what?